Hello and welcome to the Sourdough Mamas podcast. I'm Heather and I do my best to supply helpful information to people online about sourdough. So, whether that's through my Instagram channel, the YouTube channel, the Sourdough Mamas Facebook group, or through this podcast, I love to provide information. That is where my heart is. I am a giver, I am a carer, and I like to provide for people. And so, if you're looking to dig deep into more sourdough resources, I do have a page called courses.leavenly.com, which you should definitely check out. There's everything there from a full guided video course for every part of the sourdough process. There is a sourdough scoring workshop, and there's also a daily workshop that you can sign up for that's completely free that will walk you through the process of building a sourdough starter from scratch. So head on over to courses.leavenly.com. There's so much more over there as well. And I want you to check those out and get your sourdough game going. So speaking of sourdough game, have you guys ever seen the beautiful loaves with things inside them like full of cheese, herbs, bacon, apples, cinnamon, cranberries? My mouth is watering right now. I wish I had some here right now. My personal favorite that I like to make is the bacon cheddar. My husband really likes when I do bacon cheddar jalapeno, but I'm a giant baby. I'm from Canada. I don't like my food super spicy. So I don't like the jalapeno in there. Although I've been told it doesn't really add too much spice. It's more so for the flavor. But the bacon and cheddar is my absolute favorite. Second runner up from me is cinnamon raisin or anything with apple cinnamon raisin, any combination thereof, I absolutely love. So all those breads have inclusions. And so adding inclusions to sourdough bread is a really fun way to incorporate different flavors and also new textures, a different appearance, etc. Adding inclusions to sourdough bread is really, really simple once you understand some basic principles. So first of all, is a recipe even necessary? You can go on Google for sure and type in something like cinnamon raisin sourdough bread, and I'm sure it'll populate several different recipes with those inclusions added. But just know, kind of like how we talked about in the sourdough discard episode of the podcast, how you don't need a recipe for everything. If you just know some fundamentals, some basics, you can turn any recipe into a discard recipe. And it same goes for inclusions. So you can add anything to your sourdough bread once you know some kind of guiding principles. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And it's really fun. It's really going to empower you guys to A, use your imagination, and B, really sit to think about what flavors you want to incorporate in your bread. And C, do something new that maybe you haven't done before. And if you have made sourdough with inclusions before, maybe do a different type. So something completely out of the box, maybe even a flavor that you wouldn't eat normally yourself and you can gift it to somebody. So that's kind of the challenge here with this episode. First, I do want to say, I hope you can't hear my space heater. It's 17 degrees here in Golden, Colorado, and I'm looking out the window and it's snowing like crazy. I'm in a drafty old sunroom where I record and do all my work. This is where my little office is, and it gets really cold in here. So normally when I'm recording my podcasts, I like to eliminate all outside noises. I always record when my kids are in daycare because that would just be impossible if they were here. But I can't turn off the space heater because I would freeze. So hopefully it's not loud and annoying in the background. So I honestly don't think you need a recipe, like I was saying. You can definitely look up recipes. Okay. I don't want to, I'm not going to sit here and crap on those who need a recipe or those who make recipes because there's definitely time and place for that. I just want you to know that you can use a little bit of your creative freedom in making these inclusion loaves. So I play around with a different types of inclusions. And mostly when I do it, I kind of just wing it. So I know not everybody is as careless as I am. And so don't fret. There are guidelines and techniques to make sure you get it right. But if you're a reckless baker like me, just figure out what flavors you'd like and make it happen. Grab a handful and make a judgment call of whether you have too much or too little and just kind of go for it. Jump in with 2 feet. But if you want to follow it a little bit more scientifically and make sure that you get it right, here are some ideas. So the best way to add inclusions is to weigh them out, and you will add them either during the third fold or during the pre-shape phase. And we're going to touch on that in a few minutes. But in the baking world, we use baker's percentages to calculate the amount of ingredients to add. So you might have heard of baker's percentages before. And as a general rule of thumb, you are going to want to start with 20% inclusions. So if you find it's too much, cut it back a little bit. And if you find that it's not enough, add some more. But generally, in the baking world, people say to start with 20%. So baker's percentages can stump some people. And I do get that because I am not a math person at all. So here's a really easy example. So say you want to add cheddar cheese cubes to your bread, and you're making my simple sourdough recipe, which I'll have a link to in my show notes, or you can just find it on leavenly.com. It uses 1,000 grams of flour total. And so 20% of 1,000 is 200. So you would use 200 grams of cheese, right? Pretty easy. So don't overthink it too much. And also you need to think about your ratios within that 20%. So here's a really great example. Recently on the Sourdough Mamas group, Rita asked, "Hey mamas, I have a question for inclusions. I'm going to try a rosemary parmesan inclusion this weekend. 2 questions. Is the 2% rule for both inclusions, 10% parmesan and 10% rosemary? And for the rosemary, do you get a stronger flavor with the dried or fresh?" So this was a really great question. People really came and stepped up and answered this question based on their experience. And so Mia said that 10% of rosemary will be way too overpowering. And she said that she uses a teaspoon of dried or 2 teaspoons of fresh rosemary for a batch of 300 grams of flour. So that's kind of a good starting point. Debbie said something similar. She said 20% total inclusion, like I just mentioned. She said, however, I use 4 to 5 grams of fresh rosemary per 830 grams of flour because it can be very overpowering. So ultimately, Rita found out that she needed a higher proportion of parmesan to rosemary. So she would still do 20%-ish, but certainly not 10% rosemary, 10% parmesan. It would probably be like, 3 to 4% rosemary. I don't know what percentage she actually ended up at, but that's just a really great example. So if you're adding multiple inclusions, you have to think about their flavor profile and how they're going to taste in the bread. If you don't know, and if you just want to go for it, a good starting point certainly would be to do 50-50. But from experience, I know that you might think that you need a certain amount of one thing, and then you go to add it, and you're looking at it before you add it to your dough, and you're thinking, geez, that looks like an awful lot of whatever it is you're going to add. Like that's going to be way too much. You have to trust your gut. So if you think it's too much, don't use it all. If you think that it won't be enough, add some more. And take notes along the way. Make sure you're taking notes about how much you're adding so that if it does turn out great, you can replicate it and make changes the next time you bake. So this is how we become better bakers, right? We take notes and we learn from our experience. We learn from our quote unquote mistakes, but I don't like to call them mistakes because you're still going to end up with really delicious bread. So they're edible mistakes. So that's a really great example with the rosemary and the Parmesan cheese. Prepping your ingredients, you're going to need to prepare certain ingredients for inclusions. Obviously, things like cheese and things like that, you need to have them cut up and cubed. But certain things will need to be soaked, cooked, or toasted, depending on what they are. And this is done to prevent unwanted changes to your hydration and also to add better flavor. So soaking ensures that the inclusion doesn't take any water from your actual dough. For example, you can imagine adding dried raisins to some dough, and you know what happens to raisins when they're surrounded in water. They absorb the water and they become more plump and more juicy, and they're no longer dried. Well, that's what they're going to do in your dough. They're going to sit in there and they're going to suck the water from your dough and make themselves all plump and juicy while robbing hydration from your actual dough itself. So it'll bake differently. So that's why it's necessary to soak certain things, either overnight or just for several hours before baking. That's the guideline. Personally, I have forgotten in the past to soak my raisins. And so what I did was I put them in a bowl with boiling hot water and I soaked them for the few minutes that it took to, I, well, I guess it'd be like an hour or so as I'm mixing my dough. So I forgot to soak them the night before or that morning. It just occurred to me as I started to mix the dough, oh shoot, I need to soak my raisins. And they were fine. So if you do it at the last minute, that's totally fine too. Just make some kind of effort to soak those dried fruits, like raisins, cranberries, dried cherries, dried apples, anything like that. You're going to want to soak them a bit. It also decreases the risk of the fruit burning if it's on the outside of the loaf. So you can imagine having dried fruit on the outside of the loaf. It's already dry and it's being exposed to this extreme heat. It's going to burn. The soaked fruit might also char a little bit, but it's going to burn a lot less if it is soaked through. So cooking is necessary for certain ingredients because they need to be prepared in advance. Things like rolled oats, sweet potatoes, bacon, quinoa, things like that. Obviously, you're going to want to cook your bacon before you put it in. And if you have to cook your ingredients, make sure that they're nice and cool before you add them to the dough. And rolled oats, I say, kind of with a grain of salt, because if you're using them as an inclusion, you're going to want to cook them. And if you're using them on the top of your bread as like a decoration, if you're rolling your dough or if you're sprinkling them on top, you don't need to cook those. Those can just go on raw and they make the bread look really pretty. I love the look of bread with rolled oats on the top. One of my favorite things actually to make is a sourdough sandwich loaf. And I brush the top with an egg white and then I sprinkle on some rolled oats on the top, uncooked. And then I score it and throw it in the oven. I love the way that that comes out. It just looks so inviting. It looks wholesome. It looks delicious. I love it. So that was kind of an aside, but I'm just, can you tell I'm hungry and I haven't baked bread in a while? So we talked about soaking. We've talked about cooking. Now let's talk about toasting. So toasting is a really delicious idea for certain ingredients like nuts and seeds. Pecans, almonds, sunflower seeds, sesame seeds, so many things like that would really benefit from a quick roast in the oven for a few minutes under some high heat. Or they could be done on a skillet on the stove. However you want to toast them is fine, but it just adds that little bit of toasted nutty flavor to your bread. It's going to be much better. But that said, you don't have to do that. If you're making a seeded loaf with say sesame seeds, sunflower seeds, and poppy seeds. I'm blanking right now. I can't think of any more seeds, but you don't need to toast them if you don't want to. You can just add them raw as is, and that's fine too. So just an option. There's all kinds of options, and ultimately it's up to you what you want to do. All that being said, I've seen posts on the Facebook group where other reckless bakers like me go in and toss in some dried fruit like raisins, and it seems to turn out just fine. So that's the funny thing with sourdough is that there's these guidelines and then you can kind of veer off and not listen to the guidelines at all and it still turns out great, right? Like we've heard stories about people leaving their bread in the fridge for like 3 days, forgetting all about it. I'm sorry, their dough when it's cold proofing in the fridge for 2 or 3 days, completely forgetting about it. And they pull it out and bake it and it's fine. Like how is that even possible? We've heard stories of people forgetting their starter in the back of their fridge for months and they feed it a couple times and it's as good as new. So sourdough really truly is super forgiving. So don't overthink it. That's the thing I'm going to say with inclusions and with sourdough in general. Just try not to overthink it. It's really easy to do because there's a lot of overwhelming information online. When to add inclusions. So you can add inclusions literally at any part of the process. It is kind of the Wild West. It doesn't matter. Different people are going to say different things. And of course, I have an opinion on it too. So my opinion is certain ingredients can be added during the third fold and certain ingredients can be added during the pre-shape. So things like seeds and nuts and herbs can be safely added during the third fold. You would just sprinkle your inclusions on top of the dough and then work them in like you work in your salt, kind of push them down using your fingertips and then do your fold and then do your fourth fold or however many folds you're doing. Some people do 6. and then your pre-shape and your shape. So during those steps after adding the inclusions, it's going to get all mixed in really thoroughly. So you don't need to worry about it not being mixed in. Doing it in the third fold, I find just keeps the dough more cohesive with less interruptions, I guess is a simple way to say it. And also, it's probably something that you're more familiar with. You're probably more familiar with folding a dough without things inside. So if you do the first two folds without anything inside, then you can add them in the third fold. And so that's what I tend to do. But again, if you want to add them in the first fold, also fine. You do you. That's how sourdough works. You can kind of do whatever you want. There are some ingredients though that I recommend adding during the during the pre-shape. And there is a reason for that, because we want to keep as much of these certain inclusions inside the dough as possible to prevent the ingredients from being on the surface of the dough during baking, and therefore protecting them from being burned or charred or melted or whatever the case might be. So here are some examples from my experience. Ingredients like raisins, cheeses, chocolate, orange peels, they're good examples of inclusions that should be added during the pre-shape, okay? Because when you're pre-shaping and shaping, you can do your best to keep the ingredients inside the dough ball. And it's okay if a few pierce through. Things like cheese, like cheddar cheese cubes, will tend to pierce through with the corners. They pierce the dough pretty easily. And that's okay, but just try to keep, by and large, try to keep the ingredients inside the dough. You don't really need them on the outside for decoration, and they're just going to end up not looking very pretty anyway. Not that sourdough has to look pretty by any means, but they probably won't have the desired effect. Like for example, one time I was playing with inclusions and I had this idea if I used M&Ms, like the rainbow colored M&Ms, the chocolate ones, the colors from the shell would transfer into the dough and it would make a really pretty rainbow color. And so I added them during the third fold and I got them all mixed in nice. And I figured they would sit on the outside and have these pretty little colorful circles on the outside. It didn't work out that way at all. The outside of the bread looked like a regular loaf with just some strange miscolored shapes on the top. It was still actually a decent looking loaf, but of course I imagined it to come out like as if you had stuck the M&Ms on the outside of the bread. I don't know why I thought that would happen. I mean, Heather, you're putting chocolate in a 500-degree oven. Of course it's going to melt, but that's kind of how I envisioned it. And I was way wrong. But when you cut into it, the cool thing was it did have a rainbow effect on the inside and there were chunks of chocolate on the inside. So my learning from that is if I were to do M&Ms again, like maybe if I'm baking for my kids or I don't know, some other, just if you want to treat with chocolate bread, because that's delicious and why the heck not, I would do it during the pre-shape. I would add those M&Ms during the pre-shape. And that's something really fun to play with. So if you want to play around with M&Ms, I highly recommend that. It was really, really delicious. But again, like I wish I could, I wish I could had written down, you know how you hear interviews and people will say, and I'll often ask this too, if you could have start over, what would you do differently? If someone asked me that, I would say I would keep a journal of all the things that I screwed up because it would be full by now. And I would want to track how it turned out, if it actually was a disaster, or if it just didn't go according to plan. And I can guarantee you that like 95% of them would not be a disaster. The only thing that comes to mind that actually was a disaster was the infamous bread that I forgot to salt, and I baked it and everything and it came out fine, but it tasted really awful. So I turned that into breadcrumbs, but the rest of them were fine. They were completely edible. And I think sometimes we just get caught up in trying to be perfect, trying to have this, you know, having this set idea like I did with the M&Ms. And then when it doesn't come out, being disappointed, either in the bread or in the process or in ourselves, we get frustrated. I get so sad when I hear stories like that because A, I've been there and I know what it's like. And B, I know that it doesn't have to be that way. So let's just try as a community to not beat ourselves up about things that we might do quote unquote wrong in the sourdough process, especially if you're taking that leap of faith and you're making an experiment and you're just trying something new. Do not beat yourself up if it doesn't work out, okay? You need to just get up and try again, take notes and just try and try again until you perfect it, and you will perfect it. Because ultimately what you're doing, if you look at it from a different lens, is you are creating and curating your own recipe. So you have this base recipe for the bread and you are making it your own. You are writing a recipe as we speak by experimenting with inclusions. So how cool is that? You can absolutely nail it, write down the exact amount of grams, and then you can replicate it. Your kids can replicate it, your friends, your grandkids. So just stick with it because it really is worth it to experiment. If you don't mind the burned or charred appearance on the top of the crust, then by all means, you can absolutely add it during the third fold. Those certain ingredients that I mentioned. If you don't really care, go ahead and add it anytime. Like I said, sourdough is kind of the Wild West and you can kind of do whatever you want. So we've talked a lot about solid ingredients. So let's talk a bit about liquid ingredients. And this is kind of one of the last points I'm going to touch on in the episode. Sometimes you're going to want to add ingredients that are considered a liquid. So things like yogurt, some purees, like a pumpkin puree, maybe beer. In these cases, you're going to want to replace up to 20% of the water in the recipe with the liquid inclusion. And again, that is just completely a guideline. So you take 20% of the amount of water that you're adding, you remove it from the recipe and you add in your liquid. So go with that general guideline and just see where it takes you. You can't add liquid ingredients in addition to your regular amounts of water. So it's gonna completely throw off your sourdough hydration. It's gonna make everything more difficult. You're not gonna know what to expect, and you're gonna have this dough that you don't really know what to do with. So just replace that 20%. Don't just add it on top. Now, that said, I have seen on the Sourdough Mamas group, guys, I'm telling you, if you're not over there, I see so much stuff. It's so great. People have replaced the entirety of the water in the recipe with pickle juice. Like the juice from a jar of pickles, they replaced the water with that. So I couldn't even believe this. So Merle commented, Merle made the original post with pictures and her bread looked absolutely beautiful. And she said, I replaced all the water with pickle juice and I added 1 tablespoon of dill weed to Heather's high altitude dough recipe. So as an aside, if you live at high altitude above 2,000 feet, you should be using the high elevation sourdough bread recipe. I'll put a link to that in my show notes so you can find it on leavenly.com. If you're below 2,000 feet, go ahead and use the simple sourdough recipe. But so she is at altitude. She's using the high altitude dough recipe. And she said she only put in 20 grams of salt. And she said, I can't wait for sandwiches. So I guess it's like a dill and pickle flavored bread, which completely blows my mind. And I'm dying to try this. I love that idea. But she literally took all of the water and replaced it with pickle juice. So that just goes to show the 20% rule is kind of a guideline, but it can kind of just go right out the window if you try something new and it works. And gosh, it's just making me so hungry. The last thing to consider is the shape of the bread that you're going to want to make. And that is going to be based on what exactly you're adding to your bread. So different shapes for different inclusions. So generally it's kind of like sandwich loaf versus boule or batard. So the sandwich loaf is made in a pan, in a bread pan or a Pullman pan. It's got the straight sides. It looks like a loaf of bread you'd buy from the store versus a boule or batard. And a boule is the circular shaped loaf and a batard is the oval shaped loaf. And those are the free-form loaves that you shape and bake in a Dutch oven. So depending on your desired outcome, you can make your loaf a different shape. So for example, something like a pesto swirl or a cinnamon raisin swirl would work best as a sandwich loaf because you can add it on top and roll it up like a jelly roll and then put it inside the pan. So then it's going to make that really nice swirl pattern. Things like cheddar bacon, apricot pecan, for example, would present better as a boule or a batard. So use your creativity when you're adding your inclusions to your sourdough. Think about how it's going to appear when you score it. Or if you're just completely reckless like I am, just kind of go for it and wing it and see what happens. I would love if you guys would head over to Sourdough Mamas group on Facebook if you're on Facebook and share your inclusion stories, your pictures, if you're going to try it, if you tried it based on this podcast episode. I want to hear about it because I love hearing these stories so much. So as you're baking, just keep the final presentation in mind. And I want to go over a list of inclusion ideas. These were kind of populated by the sourdough mamas in our group. I asked everybody there a little while back for their ideas for inclusions, what they've used. And so here are a few examples. So you're going to want to write these down. So for a sweet flavor profile, I have so many here. There's cherry chocolate, sunflower seeds and honey, oats and honey. And then of course, cinnamon is a popular one. There's cinnamon raisin, there's cinnamon sugar and raisin, there's cinnamon raisin and apple. One that I haven't tried that sounds really great is cardamom, orange peel, cloves, and honey. That would be just an incredible loaf of bread. Pumpkin puree and cranberries would be great for the fall and winter. Maple pecan and cinnamon, again with the cinnamon. Raisin walnut, blackberries and yogurt, and mashed sweet potato are also really good ideas. And finally, lemon and white chocolate is a really unique one that sounds amazing. And for the savory flavor profile, you could try a cheddar bacon. Again, you can add jalapeno to that. Gorgonzola cheese is a good one. Caramelized onions and Gruyere. Sun-dried tomato and feta. That's one I'm dying to try. I think that would be so good for like a summer picnic. Pesto, everything bagel seasoning, I've seen people add. Just as a note with the everything bagel seasoning, a lot of them include salt. So you're going to want to see how much salt is in that everything bagel recipe and adjust as necessary. You could even add it at the very beginning and just replace all of your salt with that and see how it turns out, or remove half of your salt. You'll have to kind of play around with it, but that's just an aside. I discovered that when I tried to make bagels once, that there's quite a lot of salt in everything bagel seasoning. So there, you can learn from my mistake again. That's what I'm here for. I'm here to share my mistakes so you guys don't have to make them. I've heard that buttered quinoa is really good, roasted garlic parmesan, buttered oats, beer and cheese. Hello. Replace 20% of the water with beer and add some cheddar cheese. Yes, please. And finally, the weirdest one that I've seen people do is flamin' hot Cheetos and Takis. So you can add literally anything to your bread. I mean, just get creative and think outside the box. So I hope you guys got some really great ideas from this episode. I challenge you to go forth and bake an inclusion loaf. Even if you've done it before, I want you to do it again and do something new. Don't be scared. Just try it and take notes and make changes if you have to in your future loaves, and try to really perfect that loaf. That's my challenge to you. Take it or leave it. It's on the table. I want to go and make one of those amazing loaves that I mentioned, especially the lemon and white chocolate. That sounds so incredible right now because, again, I'm starving. I don't know why I always do these podcasts when I'm hungry. It's like going grocery shopping when you're hungry. It's just not a good idea. So if you have a chance, please head over and leave a review for the show at leavenly.com/Apple. I would really appreciate that feedback. Click the link to open Apple Podcasts. And then also don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you're notified every time you get that there's a new episode uploaded. Have a wonderful day, guys. And I hope you have sweet dreams about sourdough bread inclusions. Happy inclusion baking. I'll see you next time.